Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Los Angeles Public Library interview with Conor Knighton, the author of Leave Only Footprints, My Acadia-to-Zion Journey Through Every National Park. We are so excited to see you today. A couple of announcements before we get started. One is remember to get your library card where you can check out Conor's book. If you live in Los Angeles, you can get a library card instantly by going to lapl.org and signing up for a digital e-card. And then you'll have access to movies, music, books, audiobooks, and more. So I hope you do that. We're also in the middle of our summer reading challenge, and attending this program counts as an activity. The summer reading challenge is for all ages. So again, you can sign up at lapl.org/summer. And last, we are doing an archive of this coronavirus period called the Safer at Home Archive. And we invite you to submit your materials, photos, essays, poems, whatever you want. You can see more on our website, and we're going to create a digital archive of that. So with that, thank you again for coming, and I would like to introduce CBS Sunday Morning correspondent Conor Knighton, and we are going to talk about his book. Hi, Conor.
Hello, how are you doing?
Good, how are you?
All right, good to see you.
Good to see you as well. Thank you so much for doing this. We are so excited to have you here. I thought we would just start with a little bit. So your book is about the year you spent visiting all of the national parks, right? So how did this plan come about? How did you decide to do this? And tell us a little bit about the book too.
Sure. So you're generous to call it a plan, because it was not much of a plan at all. In 2015, so the book documents 2016, which was the 100th anniversary of the National Park Service. Right. Midway through the year before that, I had a very different vision for what 2016 would look like. I was engaged to be married. I was supposed to get married midway through 2016. Midway through the year before, that all fell apart. All of a sudden, I was unengaged, or whatever the word would be for that, and sort of adrift. I was at that time in kind of a self-imposed self-quarantine, where much like now, I was sitting around the house and moping, and my buddies were like, listen, you need to get back out there. You need a change of scenery. I ended up overcorrecting in that department quite a bit. I'm sure see every national park in the country was not what they had in mind. But around that same time, I had seen an article about the upcoming centennial of the National Park Service. I was a freelance correspondent back then for CBS Sunday Morning, which is the type of show that would do a story about the national parks. And so I was suggesting to my superiors there that perhaps I would do that. And then at the very last minute, I deleted that email and outlined a much more ambitious proposal, which was we should do a year's worth of stories on the parks. Wow. And at the time, there were 59 national parks. So even if we did every week, every Sunday, we couldn't have gotten to them all. So they, after a lot of back and forth, they agreed to the outlandish plan and said, you know what, let's do a third of them for the broadcast. Okay. And so, which was the right decision. But I think I also made the right decision in saying, you know what, if I'm going to go and be so close to these other 2/3 of places, there's 8 national parks in Alaska. If we're doing 3 for the show, I'm going to hit the other 5. I gave up my place. I'd been living in Pasadena, gave up my place, put my stuff in storage, and used all that money that I had been spending to live in LA full time to hit all the rest of the parks on my own. So most of these were just for me. In the book, I talk about them all. So I had a chance to tell some of these stories on TV. But what I found was the 2/3 of the parks we did not highlight on the broadcast were just as fascinating. And so when that year concluded, I went back and wrote the story of that. So somewhat of a personal journey, and mostly a love letter to the national parks.
Yeah, it's really an amazing journey and an amazing book. So you had just alluded to the fact that you did not plan that much for this, but I am curious. Obviously, the book goes into a lot of detail about the history of the parks and the science going on in the parks. So did you do any research before you planned on the trip? Before you went on the trip, and did you have to prepare any or learn any special skills to go on, this trip?
Yeah. So the plan, first of it, I mean, I was surprised how many of them I had never heard of, which in a way convinced me that there would be enough material there, because, looking down the line, there's Yellowstone, there's the Everglades, but there's also Gates of the Arctic, Dry Tortugas, American Samoa National Park. And so it very quickly became a puzzle of weather, geography, and story selection, figuring out there are certain times of the year where you can't go to these places because they're inaccessible for weather conditions. Not wanting to do too much backtracking, although I ended up doing a fair amount of that for the last concern, which was finding the story. So the research I did, and I continued to do it all year long, and then actually in the writing phase of this book, I went back and did it for a lot of the parks that I just went for
Okay.
fun, was trying to find what those interesting angles were. In terms of skills, I didn't, I mean, I've hiked all my life, I've camped. I thought I was going to be fine on that until all of a sudden, 3 or 4 parks into the year, Biscayne National Park in Florida pops up. That's a park that's 95% water, just 5% land. And if you're going for the 5% land, yeah, there it is right there. So that is on the Underwater Heritage Trail, which is a trail in the loosest sense of the word. You basically boat from shipwreck to shipwreck, and you dive down to the bottom, and you see a sign like that you'd expect to see on a trail in the Great Smoky Mountains. They have on the ocean floor. To get there, you need to be scuba certified, which I was not. And so that was, and when I got to Miami, which is the closest major city to where that park is, I went through, a few days of scuba certification. I did not take well to it. It was traumatic. We're just not meant to be that far underwater. Although I've now since been several times and really have come to love it. And it's because it opens up this entire hidden world. The ranger I spoke to there, who was an underwater archaeologist, which is just such a cool title to have.
Yeah.
He mentioned that it felt almost like he had a chip on his shoulder, that like other parks are known for their vistas and their scenery. And he's like, we have all of that. It's just beneath the surface. We have that same topography that a Yellowstone might, or that a Grand Teton might. It's just on the ocean floor. And so in addition to these shipwrecks, which were amazing, there's also all kinds of aquatic life. So it ended up being one of my favorite parks. But yes, there were some skills required.
Yes, definitely. Now, if an ordinary person went to this park, I mean, do they do these dives for anybody who has a scuba diving license, or is it kind of a specialized thing that?
I mean, anyone with that certification can do it. The problem is you need a boat. That park's shame. They felt bad that they did not offer more of a program to get folks out onto the water. They have a few a year, but and I kind of get why they don't. It would be very expensive to do, but they were looking to have a partner with like a tour operator who would do that. But that's what I found, is that while the parks are for everyone, there are certain experiences in the parks that are very specialized. A lot of the Alaska parks, just to even access some of them, you need a seaplane or be a passenger on a seaplane or a boat. And so there's some that are very inaccessible, although are well used by the communities local to that park. As a tourist, they're not all just, I mean, the Grand Canyon is, you drive through the gate, you see the view. They're not all as simple as that. And that was a lot of the fun, and the challenge was figuring out how to get to those that were a little bit more inaccessible.
Which do you think was the hardest to get to? I mean, was it Biscayne or one of the Alaska?
Yeah, so the farthest was the National Park of American Samoa. It's 7,000 miles from Washington, D.C. It is still very much America, but you kind of almost don't believe it is, because it's taken so long to get there. You fly to Hawaii from LA, which is where I was coming from at the time, and then that same length of a flight, you fly again to get all the way there. But those are commercial planes, so it's actually not that hard to get there. It's just a long time. The parks in Alaska, so Kobuk Valley and Gates of the Arctic National Park, are frequently the least visited of the national parks. Sometimes they don't even bother tracking who goes that year because there's so few people. It's also very hard to measure. And so for that, you need to hire or find your way onto a what they'd call like a bush plane, like a small 10-passenger plane. I will never complain about turbulence on a domestic Delta flight again, because when you're on this like rickety, like wagon in the sky is what it feels like. But that was the way to get there. Lake Clark National Park in Alaska, those are the more challenging ones. In the lower 48, Isle Royal, which is off the coast of northern Michigan, that's probably the most challenging to get to in the lower 48.
Okay, interesting. Was that the park where you don't have any access to cell phones and wireless for a week, and you're just kind of on your own?
Yeah, that was exactly the one. And sadly, that's an increasingly scarce resource. And it's weird to even think about that as being a resource, but to have a cell phone free zone. I mean, obviously you could turn off your phone at any of the parks, and I would recommend people do that, but that's tough, when you know that there's a whole world of likes and comments and stuff in your pocket. Isle Royal doesn't give you a choice. You are disconnected both from mainland Michigan, and then also from the rest of the world. And so it was, once you settle into that, there's a bit of terror that happens for a second. You're wondering what's happening. I'm still doing some pieces for work, but that became really freeing. And that weirdly is what I came to like most about that park, is that you're really out there. It's also because it's so inaccessible, it attracts a parkier type person. I think there's no van load of tourists that can drop you off at a place like that. If you're there, you are in it. So while it is low visited, I think it has one of the longest rates of, and like in terms of time of visitation, so minimum 3 days, because otherwise it's not worth it. So
right.
I like that too.
Well, that's really interesting. Well, why don't we go back to the book for a second? So at what point during this journey did you decide that you wanted to write a book about the experience?
I mean, I may have secretly thought that fairly early on, only because I knew the guy that goes to half of the parks does not get a book. Guy that goes to all the parks, there's maybe a book, but like I never written a book before. I didn't have a literary agent. Like I had no idea if I had the desire or the talent to do it, but I at least thought that it was a premise that might be interesting. And then pretty quickly I realized there was enough material there. I was meeting fascinating people. I was going to these very interesting places. I'd known everything was going to be scenically beautiful. I was surprised just how interesting everything was. And so, but it wasn't until the year was over. I didn't write a lick of it outside of some notes and some journal entries until the beginning of the next year, when that calendar year finished and I did successfully go to all the parks. Then I started thinking about what might come next, and then started to outline what a book would be.
So you mentioned already that for some of the parks you were doing stories and some of the parks you were on your own. So for the parks that you were doing stories, who did you have with you, and how did that differ from the parks that you were on your own?
Yeah, so it was unique in terms of TV news, at least, in that I, for the most part, had a consistent person with me. And that was on my recommendation. I knew that, like, because it was going to be so weather dependent, it'd be great if I could have someone whose primary focus was filming these stories. And it ended up becoming this beautiful budding bromance throughout the course of the year. His name's Efrain Robles. I'd worked with him on a show years before in Phoenix, Arizona. Actually, that's him right there. Yeah, that's literally a friend in a low place, because that is at Badwater Basin in Death Valley, the lowest point in the country. And actually, at Biscayne, that park with the scuba diving, he was going to film me on the boat, and that was the first shoot that we'd done together after like 2 years of not even seeing each other in person. He shows up in Miami. As he's getting on the boat, he just kind of casually mentions, more to himself than to me, "Oh, it's going to be my first time on a boat." I was like, "You're what? Like first time ever on a boat?" Like I assumed he meant a speedboat. So very quickly I ran down the list of boats: pontoon boat, kayak, none of it. And so I was just surprised. It made me realize how little I know about this guy. What's his life? How's he never been on a boat? And not that that's that much of achievement. I was just surprised. And then, that sort of kicked off a really interesting getting to know you period. We went to Big Bend National Park in Texas. And that's a park where I'd highly recommend, if anybody goes, you can cross over into Mexico. Efrain came from Mexico when he was 5, and crossing back across that border, that's it right there. That's the middle of the Rio Grande, which is so shallow you can walk across it. I kind of thought it would be more grande, but it is very pequeño there, and I think for most of its run. But it was really special to experience that with him. And I write about that in the book, as he talked about that difference between what his life could have been and what it is, and the significance of that crossing, almost 30 years later at that point, was a really interesting window into his life. And then also that seeing other tourists experience Boquillas. That's the town on the other side of the border of, it had been closed off for many years, and now you can legally cross back and forth through a checkpoint in the park.
Yeah, that was a really wonderful chapter. I love that chapter, and especially your descriptions of the meals that you ate on the other side. So that was great. Another thing I liked about the book was the way you structured it by theme instead of, just going by order of the parks that you went to, right? How did you decide to make that decision, or how did you decide to do that? And how did you decide where to put each part? Like, for example, I noticed that, Katmai in Alaska and the bears were in the sound section instead of the animal section. And how did you make all those choices?
Yeah, there were a few like that could have theoretically gone into multiple ones. And so, and to back up a bit, the first thing I thought of, and I think it'd be the first thing most people would think of when it comes to writing a book about a year-long journey is to make that a chronological journey.
Mm-hmm.
And then I tried a version like that, and I abandoned it pretty quickly because it didn't have to be the interesting way. There were these pockets that were really interesting, and then just kind of like a dull spring. The backtracking made it confusing. And then I realized the asset that I had, the advantage of going to all of the parks and not just some of them, is that you are able to draw out these themes and these threads that connect these vastly different places. So Big Bend, that park we were looking at in Mexico, I include that in a chapter about borders. And the other park in that is the National Park of American Samoa. There's not an obvious geographical link between those two. Those parks are never included in the list together. But for me, they told a story of what it's like to be American and sometimes still feel not quite American. In the sound chapter, I knew that the story I wanted to tell about Great Sand Dunes National Park in Colorado was a story of sound. It's the quietest place in the country. So that was like locked in. And then you're right, there were some others. I told the story about Katmai because it's a park where they tell you to be loud. You're supposed to make as much noise as you can to scare away the bears. But there was this puzzle, almost like the postcards I have behind me now. I had note cards on the wall of like, almost like I was solving a murder or something, where I'm like, okay, I've got this here. This can go with, it could go with animals, it could go with sound. And so the downside to the way that I structured it, or the premise at least, is that like, you got to talk about every park. I can't just cut out 5 parks. They're all in there. And so at some point I was like, oh, Voyagers in Minnesota, where do you go? And then eventually I was like, you know what? That's actually a story of travelers. That's who the Voyagers were. They were these French-Canadian fur trappers who traversed that region. There's some parallels there to Teddy Roosevelt. And so there were these epiphanies that were happening in like Hampton Inns across the country. Like, whatever poor soul was on the other side of the wall, it's hearing me be like, I've cracked the light pollution chapter. But that's often how it was. So it wasn't, I wrote the easy ones first and then kind of looked at this puzzle of what I had left over and blew it up a couple of times, where I would switch and mesh things around until they felt like they fit. So if you're reading it, hopefully it feels so intentional and you can't imagine it any other way. But the truth is there was some puzzle piecing that went on behind the scenes.
Yeah, it's really great because you're looking at the parks in a slightly different way than you would. But, do you want to tell us about what happened at Katmai? Because I loved that story, even though it.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I'm glad that your favorite part is me getting almost mauled. It was not my favorite.
Well, there are a lot of favorite parts. That's not my favorite part.
Okay, all right.
It's an interesting story. And I will add, so for you can describe Katmai a little bit more, but it has a bear cam, right?
Oh yeah, you can walk that park without going to it. Yeah.
So I checked it, and unfortunately, it is not up right now. They're fixing the bear cam. So
oh no,
those of you who wanted to go to the park to go look at the bears right now, it says it's seasonal, and they're fixing it right now. So
yeah, so that's the park. If I remember, it's like mid-July, late July is when that really gets into full swing. They have what they call a predictable eruption, which basically means that the salmon appear in the same place every year. The bears have figured that out, so they also hang out there during that time. And for bears, it's like one of those sushi belt conveyor restaurants where they just hang out and salmon fly by them. What the salmon are doing, there's one successful. And anytime that happens, anytime they get one in their jaws, like the crowd erupts. There's a platform where you can safely watch this from. I'd argue that the salmon are doing the more impressive thing. They're swimming upstream, all just to make it back to where they were born. But the bears are who we cheer for. But the park doesn't keep them in cages. The bears can go anywhere they want. And so camping at that park, you're or just even walking around that park, you're aware of the bears. It's the only park that I went to that had a mandatory orientation. So when you get off the float plane, which is what I landed on, they take you into bear school and they give you the bear basics, which, keep your food away or packed up in these bear lockers, and make a lot of noise, or basically and hiking groups. I was by myself, so I tried to make a lot of noise. And until one night when I forgot to, and I'm glad I'm here to tell you that story, but it almost didn't work out that way. I rounded the bend because I was enjoying what I enjoy about national parks, which is the solitude, the quiet. Who wants to, clap all the time? But I should have been, because I stumbled upon a mom and 2 cubs, and it was, I'll never know if I was in tremendous danger or not. It's certainly, my heart started racing quite a bit. And you're backing up and you're trying to remember, do you look at him in the eye? Is that, or is that the worst thing you can do? But it ended up being fine. Actually, as far as I know, only one death by bear has happened in that park, and it was the best documentary film of like 2005, I think, Grizzly Man, about Timothy Treadwell. He lived at Katmai National Park. He also like wrestled the bears. So unless you're being a complete idiot, you can be safe. Don't do what I did, make more noise. But it's I don't want to scare anybody off of that park. It really is a special experience to be there around them, these 1,000-pound animals. And they are pretty reliably in the same spot every year. So if you have a chance to go, or watch the bear cam, that's a good way to do it.
Yes, I'm looking forward to the bear cam being up online. Well, now might be a good time to talk about another animal that you were with. There is a picture of you in Denali with the puppies. If we want to show the picture with the puppies now, and you can tell us what is going on here.
That is actually, there's a cam of them too. There's a puppy cam, but I'm sure it's not up and running yet because it is dependent on their litter. But there are like they have fans. I think the bears are kind of hard to tell apart, and they don't have names. It's like Bear 687 or whatever. The puppies, they have names. The park does a good job of highlighting them. They're canine rangers. So Denali's a park where they have had dog sleds in the park since its inception. That's historically a way that people traverse that region of Alaska. I was surprised that they still do it, just because snowmobiles, or in Alaska they call them snow machines. Isn't that better? Isn't that more efficient? And as they explained to me, not always. One of the things that's in the park's legislation, or the Wilderness Act that controls part of that park, really regulates how much sound can be put into the backcountry of that park. So dogs travel pretty silently. A snow machine is obviously very loud. And then also, snow machines dogs have memories and instincts that a snow machine doesn't have. It's very possible to drive off a cliff in Alaska. Those dogs are going to stop you. They're going to remember that they were there last season, and so they find it to be a more reliable mode of transportation. And in the summertime, the dogs kind of have the summer off, but they're used more as educational teaching tools. And in that case, online dating profile photo photo shoots. I was like, I gotta do this. Come on. Although I've been burned by that, actually. People seem to think that that's like one giant goat instead of 3 cute puppies. So I probably have put off as many people as I've potentially lured in with my
well, I'm looking at it now to see if I can find the goat in it, but I definitely
or I think it maybe just looks like a one looping creature. I mean, it's who's so lucky to have 3 puppies in their lap? I think people just don't believe it's true. But they have a litter every year that they name after something parky or Alaska-y. So there might be a litter of different names for climbing knots, or different names of Alaskan bumblebees. That was the birthday litter because it was the 100th anniversary of the Park Service. But what the key is, you want to have names that are discreet. They can't sound like another name, and short. As the ranger explained, you don't want to be yelling supercalifragilistic, whatever, long names.
Right. So do you remember any of the names of yours that you met?
Oh, they're burned into my soul. Yes, of course. I think I know all of them. It's Party, Pinata, Cupcake, Hundo, which is short for 100, and Happy. I think that was the crew. There may be one I'm forgetting. But yeah, it was weird. So in terms of scheduling stories and planning the year, pretty early on, I forget where I'd read about it, but I knew that they had a dog team at the park. The TV producer in me was like, oh, come on, like puppies. Who's gonna, that's 5 minutes of gold. I don't have to do anything. But timing the trip to catch them at maximum cuteness was challenging. So for months before that, I'm at Great Basin National Park in Nevada on the phone with the ranger at Denali, seeming like a big old creep, because I'm like, have your dogs, started laying it yet? No, as soon as that had happened, then we could start to extrapolate, and then we wanted to be there 2 weeks at least after the birth, because their eyes open up more then. And so that on its own would have been a challenging story, but that trying to hit every other park in the country was tough to figure out when I wanted to be there. But it ended up being great. I can't imagine a better time of year and a better scene for them. So.
Yeah, it sounds fantastic. It definitely makes me want to go visit the puppies. So, so because of that, because of the scheduling and the stories you were doing for CBS, you zigzagged a lot. And I know a lot of people are interested in the order you actually went to the parks, but you mentioned in the book that you probably won't ever say that. However, what I am wondering is kind of what was the most memorable zigzag that you did or journey between parks?
Yeah, and it's not that I wouldn't say it because it's some secret, it just
Right.
it would be annoying almost. You're like, wait, what? Why did you go to this one 3 different times? And like, it would just frustrate anyone who had any sense of like geography and logic. And the truth is, as I'm getting further and further past it, I could piece it together through my photos, but like I've kind of forgotten because it's sort of blurred into this park a year. But in terms of zigzags, the I went all the way back from Mount Rainier, which is near Seattle, all the way back to Great Smoky Mountains in North Carolina and Tennessee. And having passed Great Smoky Mountains on my way to Biscayne, I passed that park early and that was in like February or March. And then months later, had to cut all the way back across the country because at Great Smoky Mountains, there's a lake that was created in World War II that they had to flood for a power plant. Kind of a long story, but the park had promised to build the families that vacated those homesteads a road back to the cemeteries that they'd left up in the hills. Never built the road. There was a lawsuit because of this. But what they have done is that they bring people across the lake once per year on a boat so you can go visit your ancestors. And so that date, whatever it was, I've forgotten, but let's say, June 27th, I knew I had to be there for that. And then in Washington State, I was interviewing the Secretary of Interior, the then Secretary of Interior at Mount Rainier, like a week before. And so all of a sudden I had to hightail it back. It was worth it. It was a fascinating story and a different, I knew these stories on TV and in the book couldn't just be, oh, isn't this place pretty? And like, oh, look at these. It's nice that there's bears in some of them and dogs and others, but like, it's not all nature. And so this is much more of a story about like government distrust, the importance of like honoring your ancestors, and a story that really doesn't paint the Park Service in a particularly flattering light. And I wanted to include that. And so that was worth driving however many, miles that is back from Washington to North Carolina to then turn around and go back to Colorado, I think afterwards. So a few of those zigzags that I made a carbon credit donation at the end of the year. There was probably, I have like, there's this weird contrast of like using gas to get to these places that climate change is hurting, but I think I'm overall okay. The stories were hopefully worth it.
Right, they were. And you talk a lot in the book about the people you met in the parks as well. So what were your most memorable encounters with people in the parks?
Yeah, so whether that was a ranger, I don't think there's a boring park ranger, or if there is, I haven't met one. They were fascinating, whether it was that archaeologist at Biscayne, or a biologist who was in charge of who had spent his life studying the devil's hole pupfish, this extremely rare fish that lives out in Death Valley. But then just the other hikers, the other people that I would meet. I met a retired couple at Canyonlands National Park, and frequently when people would meet me, you just have a lot of like trailside conversations. Often the, oh, hey, where do you live question would come up. And I'd gotten kind of used to the like slight wow factor of my answer, which was like, oh, I don't live anywhere. I'm on the road. They could not have cared less. They were like, oh yeah, we've been on the road for 10 years. And so they have been RVing around the country for a decade. The only thing that dictates their life is rain. They hate rain. So if there's rain in the forecast, they'll drive to some place where there's not rain. And we're just a really beautiful couple. I've stayed in touch with them. And in this book, I tell their story in terms of a love story. It was really just like, I think everybody wants to be Tony and Linda Oyster, whether you're out driving around the country or not, like that respect and love they had for each other came through. And that was from a 45-minute conversation on the side of a trail. And I think you don't do that on a Los Angeles street, or not as much as you should. So I think those are more likely to happen in parks.
Right. Probably not even on a Los Angeles trail, I don't think.
Yeah, not always. No, because you're like, oh, maybe that person is like, I don't know, is that like the 7th most famous person on Grey's Anatomy? I think I recognize that. What should I say today? Like, yeah, there's an etiquette to LA trails that don't happen. But in a park, especially the more remote ones, you kind of already know you have something in common. You have both prioritized that as a place to spend your leisure time.
Right. Well, but one of the issues that you talk about is that so many people do visit these parks, but there is a huge lack of diversity at the parks. So, what did you learn about that during your trip? And have you seen any improvement since that time? I'm sure, the audience might not know about that. So it would be great to.
And it's because I'm embarrassed. It took me a few parks for it to really sink in. But at some point, after the third or the fourth or whatever, you're like, oh, wow, I'm seeing a lot of white people and not a lot of non-white people. And there's a variety of reasons for why that is. A small part of it has to do with geography in terms of where some of these parks are. But even when you account for that, they are not as diverse as they should be or could be.
Yeah.
And there are sort of two elements to that. One is just the moral element that, like, these are in the founding legislation for all of the people, for the enjoyment of all of the people, not some of the people. And that the Park Service is aware of that. I don't think they've always been great about dealing with it. There's a few ways to help move the needle. One is more diverse staffing on their end. It helps if a ranger looks like you,
Right.
I have seen them make some strides in that department. Obviously more could be done. But they've recognized that there needs to be more diversity in their staffing. Some of it comes from outside of the park. So the outdoor advertising industry, Patagonia, North Face, these companies, I mean, in a way, that's the thing that can shift the quickest. Changing habits, changing attitudes, changing long held relationships with the outdoors are tougher. It's real easy just to put, to diversify your campaign. That can happen by the next fiscal quarter. And so I've seen a little bit of that happening. Again, there could be more representation there, especially in more of like the extreme sports that skew pretty white. And I think recognizing that there are multiple ways to experience the outdoors, we don't all have to be the free solo guy, like there are a variety of ways that the parks, and I'm guilty of this as well, is sort of having my way of experiencing it, which involves a long hike and camping in the backcountry, but like also like having a family picnic it's the same, it's a valid way to experience that land as well. And so it's tough to know how much progress is being made, partially because the data is not great on it. So even some of the data I'm using in the book was, even at the time of writing it, a few years old. The parks are strapped for money. They don't commission many studies on this. There's not a lot of outside groups doing studies. So, and it's a very limited sample size. So there's data that says that Shenandoah in Virginia is something like 90% white. I think the park would say, well, that was years ago, and it's a small sample size, but still, like, not great. I can tell you from being on the trails, if it's not that, it's close to that, and that's a park there were whites only campgrounds in that park. And you cannot underestimate how that continues to impact things years down the line. That is, it is, if you didn't feel welcome in a place once, that's something that you continue to pass on to your kids. So, I mean, it's a multi-pronged thing. I'm glad to see places attempting to address it. And in the book, I spoke with a young woman at Mount Rainier who is one of she's worked with this group Outdoor Afro, which is one of a number of affinity groups that sort of take on what the parks and brands aren't doing, which is saying, hey, let's just lead a hike of folks who look like us and are from our community into these places. And so there's the Team Outdoors. There's a number of those groups that have sprung up to fill that void. And so hopefully that's moving in a more representative direction. In addition to the moral element that I mentioned earlier, it's also just like a survival financial element for the parks. These are funded, by Congress. This is our taxpayer money. And if we get to a point where the folks who are voting and electing representatives like don't feel a connection to these places or don't feel that they were ever welcomed there, then why would they prioritize them? So I think there's the parks need to stay relevant, and they need to increase the diversity to stay around. So
I would think that a lot of that can also happen on the local level too, right? In terms of making sure that your local parks and trails and things are accessible and appealing to everybody in your area, to get people interested in, being outside and wanting to take the trip to a national park that might be a little bit farther away for some people.
Sure. And that's one thing that the Park Service has done. They did it quite a bit under Obama, which was adding park units. So one distinction is I went to all of the national parks, which there were 59, there are 62 now. Those are created by an act of Congress. And in most cases, although not all, they are the more naturey, Yellowstone kind of spots. But the Park Service manages 400 some units, from battlefields to seashores to historic sites. And so increasing the diversity of those places and the stories they tell. I should have mentioned that earlier, but like I've seen parks start to do that. We're highlighting stories that have maybe not been, whether it's in the visitor center or on a ranger presentation, amping that up and emphasizing the diversity of stories to tell. And so there's certain parks like beyond just racial diversity, like the Stonewall is now in New York, a unit of the Park Service where it tells LGBT history. And so there's that is happening, and those are happening closer to home. Those are happening in more urban areas. They are not all vast bits of Montana wilderness. There are parks in suburban or urban Alabama, and broadening those is helping as well.
Great. Well, thank you for that. I thought it would be fun to show some more pictures from your journey. And audience, if you want to, you can start putting questions in the chat as well, because I have a few more questions, and then we can go to some questions from the audience. But so let's start with this old man picture, and you can tell us a little bit about what this is. Now, this is the picture of the basically what looks like a stick or a log in water. So what is this? What's going on here?
I'm impressed that was pulled up correct. You say old man, and you're not expecting to see a log, but that is indeed the old man of Crater Lake.
I think you labeled it as old man.
Oh, did I? Okay, I was going to say, because the behind the scenes, John pulling this up, I'm sure it's like, what? Old man? But yes, that is the old man of Crater Lake. It is a stump, although the scientist I talked to thinks stump is a little degrading for a piece of wood that he has such fond memories of. But it's been floating upright for longer than Crater Lake has been a national park. It makes no sense. Logs should be horizontal, but it bobs around the lake almost like it has like a personality. It'll travel miles in a day. There was a time where they tied it up on this island in the middle of the lake as they needed to do some research on the bottom of the lake. And as soon as they do that, it's like August, storm clouds roll in, it starts snowing. And so you've got all these scientists, PhDs, who are just sort of looking at each other being like, it can't be the old man, can it? But sure enough, they went out and they cut him free, and sure enough, the sky clears up. And I think they all felt a little embarrassed and ridiculous that they had believed in this. But I included in a chapter about mystery, and the scientist I talked to, who I was expecting to give me the counterpoint, to be like, no, this is why it is, and this is why it happens, and these are how currents and dried out wood works or whatever. He was like, yeah, I'm fine not knowing. And that really surprised me. And I thought that there was something special about that in a world where we can explain away so much of our natural world. It's nice to have a few mysteries left. And so the old man is one of those.
Well, how long is this log? And it's not attached to anything? It's just
hanging out. I mean, there's a base that's at least twice as long as what you're seeing above the surface of the water. There's some there's what looks like roots at the bottom of it, but they're not on the bottom of the lake. No, it's just bobbing around. I don't want to spoil the mystery, but I think it has something to do with like the sun drying out the top and getting kind of waterlogged. I barely even know what I'm talking about. Because as soon as he told me I didn't have to know, I was like, all right, I'm not going to learn why this happened. But it's every summer they continue to think that it may topple over. And he said it'll be a sad day when it does. So actually, within a matter of weeks, probably, they'll be knowing if the old man's out there. I believe this summer Crater Lake is not offering boat tours just because it's tough to socially distance on a boat. So I don't think anyone but the park staff will be seeing the old man. So honestly, for a log that's been around that long, I'm sure he's, once he pops his head up this summer, is going to be curious as to where everyone went. Floating around.
Yeah, I did like that in your chapter. That reminds me of your chapter about trees, about how you said that the trees, talking about the witness trees as well, and how trees have seen all of this history, that they've been around a lot longer than us. So I thought that was a really great observation.
Yeah, they feel, still have like the mountains and the rocks, but like it feels like trees see us back, like there's something about them that whether it's their height or the fact that they have arms that are kind of outstretched and like our arms, I feel a kinship to a tree more than I do to most else in nature.
Yeah, for sure. Well, why don't we do another picture, and then I'm going to do some rapid fire questions. So the volcano picture, you're on a boat. Here it is. What is happening here?
So that is I got very lucky with that park. So that's Volcanoes National Park in Hawaii. Unfortunately, unlike the other experiences that I've been talking about, that is an experience you cannot have right now, not because of COVID-19, but just because it's not erupting currently. That lava started pouring into the ocean maybe 4 days before I got to that park. It had been erupting in some form or another for many years, but just not that dramatic fall off of the cliff. I also, on a different day, walked up on the top of the cliff there. They let you get unsafely close. I mean, there's no railings. Like, I'm shocked that people don't burn their foot, because it is there, and it's up to you to just not be a dummy and fall into it. And so it's, of all the parks, that park, I'd say that's my most memorable experience. Just because there's lots of beautiful scenery but seeing new land created right in front of your eyes is pretty impressive. Feeling it. I mean, from that distance, like, the water was hot. Had I stuck my hand in, I could feel the heat radiating off of the cliffs there. We wouldn't get any closer than that. It was really special. And actually, the guys who took me out on the boat, like, they're Native Hawaiian, but like they were loving it too. You know, maybe later in the season they start to get bored of it, but it was so new at that point that they thought it was great. And years later, I guess in 2018, there was that eruption that you would have seen on the news, where a lot of houses that are really not too far from the top of that cliff were taken away by lava. And so that impermanence is kind of how I structured that chapter, in terms of the way that it can take everything away, and the peace that you make with it if you choose to live in a place like that. So that's on the Big Island of Hawaii, where lava is a constant threat. And when you book your home, or buy your home, you are buying it in a zone that is ranked by lava likelihood.
Yeah, I found it fascinating that some people did that on purpose, and the architecture you described about these houses that they purposely built into the lava and designed. So that
I mean, you could argue that there's people in California who do a version of that in purpose. The marina in San Francisco is built on a landfill. What are people thinking? Like, that is in an area known for horrible earthquakes. So there's just like that piece we make with, like, okay, I guess something bad could happen. But they're like, and actually, the man who I talked to from San Francisco, who'd moved there to live in one of those houses like you described, where he really embraced the lava, both architecturally and visually, and just also sort of spiritually. He's like, at least you get some warning with an eruption, earthquake, boom, you're done. Here, it creeps pretty slowly to your house. You have time to evacuate. And so, not to minimize the tragedy of someone's house getting engulfed by lava, but it's not a thing where typically folks are perishing because of that. You have a chance to get away. And so his theory was like, hey, enjoy it while you have it. The guys who took me out on the boat, same way. They're like, that's part of life. So
very interesting. All right, some rapid fire questions, and then we'll go to audience questions. So, the park that exceeded your expectations.
I would say Cuyahoga Valley National Park in Ohio. When we were looking down the list, my boss was like, they're not all going to be Yosemite. And so that was one that we both sort of laughed. We're like, oh, what the heck is this? And it ended up being really interesting. It's not particularly stunning in terms of scenery, but I ended up finding a really interesting story there and some really interesting folks that when I think back on it, I think of it fondly. I assumed I would not like it. Part of that's coming from West Virginia. I've got a chip on my shoulder against the entire state of Ohio. So I think the fact that I didn't just despise it was probably a plus.
Park that left you somewhat underwhelmed, that you expected to really love and were
I guess that might be also, to reference my West Virginia upbringing, Great Smoky Mountains National Park in Tennessee and North Carolina, the most visited of all of the national parks. And I think because it's so much what I was used to growing up, like, there's not much different. The Great Smoky Mountains and the Appalachian Mountains are relatively similar. It's so they're beautiful, but like the parks of Utah and Montana, that's just so different than what I know. Those really blew me away. So given its popularity, I was meh about the Great Smoky Mountains, only because that looks kind of like my backyard from childhood. So
that makes sense. Park you've been to the most?
I would say it's got to be Zion, Bryce, or the Grand Canyon. All those three I've been to a few times. They were also my first parks. So I'm not exactly
How many times do you think you've been?
4 or 5 to those. So I mean, sometimes the Grand Canyon, that's a park you can see in a couple hours. If you had a friend visiting, Arizona, I lived in Phoenix for a little bit. It was easy to scoot up there. I think that's right. I should fact check my own answer to that question. Let's say the Grand Canyon for now, and then I'll figure out if I lied to you. So, but I've been
The
back to a
last
number of them
park,
since the book, by the way.
what was that?
I've been back to a number of them since
Oh,
the
yeah.
book, many
Yeah.
of them, yeah.
Last park you went to?
Oh, that's actually, I have a great answer for that. Yesterday, I went to Lassen Volcanic National Park. It's the first park I've been to since they reopened. Most of the parks shut down across the country. They're slowly reopening. Lassen, still no visitor centers, but it's a beautiful park. One of the least well-known of the California parks. It's got kind of a weird name. It's in a more remote part of the state, but really beautiful, kind of a mini Yellowstone. It's got geothermic stuff. So there's geysers, smells kind of bad. But is beautiful and a great for this time of year.
Park you want to go back to next?
Ooh, that would be I'll say the one I was just looking at online, Glacier Bay in Alaska. That's a park.
Okay.
It's beautiful. I took a boat tour, which is what you have to do. If I had it to do over again and I had more time, I would actually camp out on some of those islands there and take like a kayaking trip, do a longer version of that park.
The best myth about the parks.
The best myth. I think it's that you need to be like John Muir to experience them. You know, you don't have to be super backpacky or, you know, like there's a version of every park where you can do that, but you don't need specialized training. You don't need specialized gear for the most part. There's a variety of ways to experience a park.
Okay. Most interesting scientific fact you learned.
Oh gosh. I'll just to give you a quick answer. That devil's hole pupfish
Yes.
to me was an interesting bit of science in terms of how on earth this rare fish exists in the middle of the hottest place in the country, in the middle of the desert in Death Valley, but also a good reminder about the importance of the Endangered Species Act. Yeah, there they are right there, and that makes them look massive. They're like an inch long, but the fact that they the Endangered Species Act is not just about saving the cute animals. And the Devil's Hole pupfish is an example of that. That platform they spent millions of dollars looking after these 100 fish in that little puddle, which is really, that's about the width and the length of it. It is deceptively deep to a depth that nobody knows, hundreds of feet deep. There's two dead bodies in there when people went scuba diving for it. I don't know why I'm laughing about that. That's sad, but it was a long time ago.
Yeah.
A long time ago, there were two dead guys in there, which is creepy and weird. But that fish is opened my eyes to what else. You think of the Endangered Species Act, you think of the bald eagle. There's also the Devil's Hole pupfish, and they're equally important.
Right. And what about the most interesting historical fact that you learned?
Oh gosh. I don't know if it counts as most interesting, but it was the biggest gap in my education. Was a lot of like Teddy Roosevelt's story. I'm sure I learned that, but it was a fascinating life, and a man who had a lot to do with the parks as we know them today. So learning some of that history, but boy, all the details. There's petroglyphs in Capitol Reef National Park, painted by a tribe and a culture we really have very little knowledge of today. And so it's not so much of a fact as the unlocking of a mystery where you're trying to figure out, is that somebody's grocery list? Is that a god? Like, what does this even mean? And so, the history of the parks exists long before they were parks. It's easy to think of them as all these things that like people went in and established, but these were people's homes. These were where people worked and lived on the land for thousands and thousands of years before they ever fell under U.S. government control. And so that history was always important to discover at every park.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so best park for social distance traveling, and by that I mean including like the food and the places to stay and all of that.
I think it's going to be tough to find a place to stay right now. As far as I can tell, the parks, for the most part, as they've reopened, are not reopening lodges. Maybe there's a few that have that I don't know of, which for certain parks, because of their remoteness, really does make you question if it's worth going to right now. Because unless you're camping, and even some of those don't have campgrounds open, but if you're not a camping type person, that means a multi-hour drive back to the tiny town where the Best Western is or something. So I'd say the parks that are best for distancing, and like Lassen, where I just was, has a variety of trails, a variety of open spaces. Where it gets tough are parks like the Grand Canyon, like Zion National Park, like even Yosemite for that matter, where there's a lot of cool stuff clustered in a small area. So Zion is a canyon. There's basically one way into that park, one main way in, and it's a park that you experience on a bus tour. Typically, I honestly don't know how they're doing it right now. Denali you experience on a bus. It's tough to distance on a bus. So those
Right.
are tougher. Whereas, ones with more room to roam, with multiple entry and exit points, are great. So actually the Smoky Mountains are really solid right now in terms of that. The key is just don't feel like you have to hike the popular trail.
Right.
There are lots of ones. So I wouldn't do Angel's Landing at Zion right now, but there are probably other smaller trails there that you can take. But with that, they're all, I mean, hey, they're all better than a football game or whatever. I mean, there's more room to distance than a movie theater. So fortunately, there aren't really bad ones.
Best park for a true adventurer.
Ooh, I'd say some of those Alaska ones. Gates of the Arctic stands out to me because that's a park where there are no trails. There are no roads. There's no visitor center. There's like one ranger's house where like he'll invite you in for a snack and like ask where you're going. But that is really only an adventurer's park. I would not recommend folks going there unless it's just a sort of touchdown, see it, and leave. But when they ask you where you're going, the answers are normally that way for like 5 days, and then that's what you do. There's bears. You've got to have all your food with you. So some of the Alaska parks are very adventure heavy. You can have adventures in all of them, but those are ones where it is not for a casual nature fan.
Right. What about for a multi-generational family trip? Which park would you recommend?
Yeah, I mean, that's where something like the Grand Canyon really shines, because like if you do feel like it's the thing that you want to see in your life, and I wouldn't disagree with that, it is a bucket list kind of park. Like you can drive basically up to the rim, and so if that's what Grandma wants to see, like you can wheel her to the rim, and then poof, there it is. One of the most impressive things, not just in this country but in any country. Those views are real accessible. Glacier National Park in Montana is an interesting mix for multi-generational, because there's some hardcore adventure in that park. There are some fantastic trails, some very challenging trails, but just the drive through it, going to the Sun Road, is frequently, on many lists of like top 5 roads in America. It is just a scenic marvel. It's an engineering marvel how they ever even made that road. And so from going to start to finish, just from the backseat of a car, you can appreciate a lot of that scenery. And then let the folks who want more of an adventure get out and hike a trail. Right.
What about for the nervous solo traveler?
The one I should recognize that while I was solo traveling, that's, as a male. And I think there's a lot of worries that I did not have that I think, a female would, understandably. So I may not be the best person to answer that question. But that said, the backcountry, all parks are like, there's this fear, and I get it, of being in the woods or something scary. Scarier things are way more likely to happen to you in a city, like by far. So I wouldn't let that the nerves of being outdoors scare anybody off. I don't know if there's one in particular I'd say is great. I mean, maybe that's something where like a Cuyahoga Valley, which I'm already regretting saying it's the one that impressed me more than I thought it would. I thought it would zero. But like that's one where it's 20 miles from Cleveland. So there's a way to take a beautiful hike in that park, and you're never that far from a Starbucks. So if you need kind of like a gateway, easy park, that's great. And also the famous ones, the ones you've heard of, Yosemite, Yellowstone, because those are such destinations, because they get so many tourists, like they've got folks who can answer your questions. They know how to deal with tourists of all ability levels and comfort levels. So whereas a more remote park might just have a ranger there. Yellowstone's got plenty of them.
I know after reading your book, the one I want to visit the most, I think, is Great Basin.
Yeah. It's a long way to get there.
Yes. I thought it was, I looked it up, and I thought it was closer to Los Angeles than it is. It's more like 8 hours or something.
Yeah.
Or more.
Well, and as I mentioned in the park or in the book, that's a park that's best seen after dark. And so the night skies there are so stunning, and especially if you're coming from Los Angeles, where that's Great Basin right there. Yeah, and that's I took that picture. I'm only average at like that kind of photography, so it looked better than I was even able to represent. But like, you can't see the Milky Way in Los Angeles. You can't see most constellations in the Los Angeles night sky, and so Great Basin is so dark, especially if you're coming from the LA area, that it's worth having that experience. There are other parks that offer dark skies. It doesn't have to be Great Basin. Big Bend in Texas has very dark skies. But just being reminded, because what's crazy is those same stars are over LA. That's not some natural feature that only exists in rural Nevada. That's everywhere. It's just that you have to turn off the lights to be able to see them. So.
Right. All right. So let's go to some questions from the audience. We have a question from John in California. If he could see only 3 of the parks, which ones would you choose?
Oh, come on. I can maybe at best give you 3 California parks, maybe. And even that. I mean, if you've never seen Yosemite, like that's for its beauty and also for its significance to the national park idea. I mean, it's everyone gives Yellowstone credit for being the first national park. I would argue maybe Yosemite should get that credit because it was protected as a state park first and then became a national park after Yellowstone was protected. So it's a bit of a technicality there. But yeah, it's fantastic. One that I had not seen after 10 years of living in LA is Channel Islands National Park. That was the closest. It's the closest park to the Studio City Library, easily.
Yeah.
And yet, I would imagine most folks who live there haven't been. Probably more have been to Joshua Tree, which is a farther drive and worth seeing. But Channel Islands, because you have to take a boat, I think is what puts people off. But it's beautiful. That's a park I'd like to do again in camp. I was just out there for the day.
Okay.
And then Latin Volcanic, where I just was, I think was great. But I mean, boy, that means I didn't get to say Death Valley is great. California, and like I can say this with no skin in the game right now. I technically do not. I used to live in California. I do not right now, and I can still say that like for scenic diversity, California wins hands down. I mean, it's got a little bit of everything. So I refuse to just choose 3. Although those are 3 to start with. I have a feeling you'll go to the other. I think what are there 9 in California? You'll go to the other 6 afterwards. Just wait.
Actually, one of the other questions was, did you visit the Channel Islands National Park? So
of course,
yes, you did.
Oh, and technically, I visited a Channel Island long before I'd visited Channel Islands National Park. So Catalina is a Channel Island.
Oh, okay.
It's sort of an example of like what they would look like if they weren't protected. So, and not that Catalina's bad, it's beautiful, but like that's got saltwater taffy shops and a movie theater and all kinds of stuff. So that same range of islands comprise what the rest of Channel Islands National Park is. The other ones are uninhabited.
All right. So we have another question. Are there videos of your travels available for us to view on the internet?
Why, yes, there are. The CBS Sunday Morning, who I continue to work for as a correspondent, they aired several of the pieces from the parks during the year that I was traveling to them. And so those are all on CBS's, I assume their website, but also their YouTube page is probably the easiest way to find them. So if you search for On the Trail is what I'd call those back at the time, or just search for my name or parks, you'll find them. I've since had the chance to see lots of national parks in other nations, which has been really interesting. I did a story in Seychelles at a national park there. I did a story in the Galapagos. So this American idea, seeing that replicated across the world has been really interesting as well. Those pieces are online.
Another question, did you ever get exhausted or have doubts about finishing on time? What kept you going through this year?
Yeah, I mean, quite a bit of that. The doubts of, I mean, those were earlier of like the what have I done kind of doubt. Like, oh my gosh. And actually think about like had it been this year, I would have been like 17 parks into the journey. And then all of a sudden, like there's someone out there who's trying to hit them all this year, I'm sure. And that person had to hang it up and go home. So I was always worried. I guess I wasn't thinking like pandemic, but I was thinking maybe I break a leg. I think there were probably some physically challenging hikes or a viewpoint I might have looked off of that I was like, you know what, I've got a lot more to do. I can't afford to sprain an ankle and be out of the game for 3 weeks. But I mean, in terms of what kept me going, it wasn't like it was some slog I was going through. I mean, it's amazing. It's the best, most scenic year of my life. So the opportunity to continue to go to all of these was fantastic. So it was stressful, the planning, and also just making sure I was staying in the right headspace when I was at the park. I was frequently planning the next one and writing about the one where I'd just been, but I wanted to make sure I was doing that not at the expense of experiencing where I was. But I would seem like a big old jerk if I complained even in the slightest about that. So it was sometimes fatiguing, but in the best way.
Right. Another question, which of the parks that you saw has been most disproportionately affected by climate change?
The one that's the poster child for that is Glacier National Park in Montana. I don't know if it would actually win for being the most affected. There's not a park that is not affected by it, but I think there's some like unfortunate poetry in Glacier National Park having no more glaciers. And that's what we're staring down. Like within our lifetime, for sure, it will have no more glaciers. It is rapidly losing them. And so that was dramatic. I went up with a reef photographer there who was taking pictures of where they used to be and showing how much they had retreated since sometimes 30, sometimes 70 years ago. Just because despite all the data and graphs that he had back in his office, a picture, is worth 1,000 words. And it was helpful for people to see that. It's dramatic when he would hold up a picture and be like, oh yeah, look, there used to be a giant block of ice right there. So that was one. But I mean, heck, Joshua Tree, is impacted by, to the point that there could potentially be no more Joshua trees at Joshua Tree because of the elevations where they grow and the changing climate there. So yeah, sadly, there's not one that I know of that is immune from the effects. It's kind of a all-way tie for first or last, or however you want to look at it. That's not great.
Oh, it looks like we have another question that just came in. The most challenging moment and the most embarrassing moment.
Challenging, I don't know. I have to think of. Embarrassing, sadly, happened 59 times. I had at some point early on decided to sing America the Beautiful in every national park. My college a cappella training came in handy. I had a pitch pipe app on my phone and I would play starting. I don't know why I thought this would be cool. I should have just collected a backpack patch from all of them, but I was like, oh no, this will be fun. And not thinking that I would have to sing that same stupid song, or a beautiful song, but it started to seem ridiculous at every park. And so without fail, at the moment where I thought no one was around me and I had a bit of trail to myself, me, oh beautiful, and then that's when the troop of Girl Scouts would come thundering past, and just I looked like I was by myself singing into my phone. And I had Hot Springs National Park is mostly indoors. I sang that in a bathhouse. Mammoth Cave National Park, I'm in a cave. Stuff echoes in caves. It was super stupid. So that was just consistent. I almost came to love the embarrassment of that. And actually, you can find that on YouTube. If you look for America the Beautiful and then my name, or on my channel, that's on there.
Yes, it's all edited together, right?
It's all edited together. That was the idea, is that I would sync them up, and so the song is the same, but the scenery is constantly changing. I'm glad I did it, but 20 parks in, I was like, oh gosh, is this really what I should have committed to doing? I should have just taken a picture by every sign and called it a day.
I love it. I think it's great. It's very unique and fun. So I think it's great. And I'm sure the people who stumbled on it thought it was great too, and not embarrassing too, as well.
Well, I guess. Yeah, I'm sure right now there's.
If they have realized now what it was, maybe there are people who are now like, wait a minute, I saw this guy 4 years ago.
I had to tell myself that would happen to all of them, because if they don't, then I just look like I'm some idiot vlogger. It's I know what I'm going to do at Great Basin, sing a song, and then just sing it. I mean, only because of cutting them all together was it worth it. Otherwise, you just look and feel very stupid. So, great song though. A song I like, honestly, better than the national anthem. I think America the Beautiful. Many people think it feels more America than this song about war, which is what our national anthem is. So
right. Well, thank you so much for doing this interview. I guess I have one question that I thought would be nice to close with, and that is, what have you taken with you from this journey, and what have you applied to your life since this time in the parks, and and especially in this strange time of the pandemic? Is there anything that you've used to help get through this?
Yeah, I think that it's reassuring to be reminded that they're still out there, to answer the last part of your question first. That's and now, having gone to Lassen yesterday, that was a really nice experience to be back. That's a photo of Canyonlands. That is still there. That vista is still the same. So as we approach a world in which we are very uncertain what our jobs, what our lives look like, what going to a movie or a restaurant looks like these places are still there, and that's because of this pretty ambitious, outlandish idea of protecting them. Obviously, that's a constantly evolving idea, so that it's not a given. But I am comforted that they are still out there, and that everything from my relationship with technology, spirituality, issues that I never even really thought much about, like light pollution we were talking about, that it's changed my way of thinking in a lot of different aspects. So it's not one thing in particular I can point to, other than realizing that relationship with nature is something that's going to continue to be a part of my life. I think the fact that, for no book, for no TV show, what I spent my day doing yesterday was going to a national park. And I've done that a number of times since. That's how I enjoy spending my time. And I'm excited that there are so many spots that I have not been, whether it's a state park or or the Huntington Library. There's plenty of beautiful nature out there that's worth exploring. So I'm excited to. I don't feel like it's over. The book is that one chapter in my life that's done, but there's a lot more out there.
Right. Now this picture is of the end of your journey, isn't it? Oh,
little Yellowstone.
Oh, now I think you may have frozen up. At least I can't.
Oh no! Oh
there
well. Well, yes, I have. Well, then that means there are two pictures of me frozen. One at a cold national park, and one on the internet because that was negative 34 degrees. I can't believe I'm not wearing gloves in that picture. But it was. Yeah, maybe it got to negative 34 that night, but it was crazy cold at Yellowstone. That was the opening day for that park in the winter. It's one of the few parks that actually shuts for a while as they plow the roads and then shuts down again before it reopens in the spring. If you're going to see it once, probably see it in the warmer months. But boy, to see it a second time, and that was my second time at Yellowstone, I saved it until very last. I wanted it to be this little Christmas present that I got to unwrap at the very end. And then it was beautiful. And it was also a reminder that go to these places once, and it's not, it's not a one and done type thing. It's in different seasons, different weather patterns. I mean, they're completely different places. And so it was technically a park that I'd been to years earlier, but it felt like a completely new experience. And so, some stranger I made take this picture. I was like, listen, I'll explain later. I just need to be triumphant right now. So, kind enough to take my picture on my way in. So.
Well, thank you so much for this lovely interview. For those of you who may have missed some of it, it is going up on YouTube and the Facebook page, so you can tell your friends about it and they can watch it as well. And remember to get your library card, and you can read Conor's book, Leave Only Footprints, My Acadia-to-Zion Journey Through Every National Park. It is available at the library on Overdrive, but you can also get it elsewhere. So thank you so much for being here with us.
Oh, hey, thank you. It was great talking to you. Thank you so much.
All right. Bye, everyone. Have a wonderful night.